thanks everybody for joining us on the webinar. So my name is John Dickinson. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer at Equal Experts, and I'm joined today by Steve Smith, who's our Head of Scaling. Also Mary Barton, who's the Forrester consultant that worked with us on the study, and also Chris Kondo, who's an analyst from Forrester, and he's got a lot of depth and breadth of experience in this space, and joined quite a few of the customer interview calls, so has a good context of the study as well. So we're really excited to have Mary and Chris from Forrester to join us to talk about the study. I just want to say a little bit about the study, though, first, and why we commissioned it before we dive into the presentation. So we work with a lot of organizations to help them deliver new digital services, but we also improve their capability to deliver and run these services for the long term. And obviously we work with some small companies, but mostly we work with quite large enterprise organizations. And over the years, we've seen particular challenges working with large organizations that need to scale their delivery capability. By this, we don't mean just sort of scaling the number of requests or transactions a second. We mean scaling their ability to deliver change. And so enabling a large enterprise generating over $1 billion or £1 billion revenue that needs to coordinate many delivery teams across a large technology footprint as quite a specific type of challenge. And so we've had quite a bit of experience and a fair amount of success helping customers do this. And so we've identified a number of patterns to help organizations achieve scale of delivery. Patterns such as building paved roads to help teams be more productive, adopting a you build it, you run it operating model, setting up teams to have alignment and autonomy, and focusing on optimizing their onboarding processes for new team members. But a lot of this work and a lot of these patterns do require some intentional investment and direction, and making the case for the investment isn't always the easiest thing to do. There's often not a direct line of sight from making 10, 20, or even 80 teams more effective to the financial benefit that will provide, which means that many organizations don't end up making that investment, so don't really achieve the benefits they're looking for when adding more people and more teams to their digital delivery organization. So the organizations where we've worked with and have had the most success in scaling their delivery, they've made that decision to invest. But many organizations don't. So we wanted to take the chance to capture and share the benefits that some of the more successful organizations we've worked with have achieved, and then hopefully through doing that, make it easier for others to make the business case for investing and scaling their digital delivery. And so this is why we really want to work with an independent expert. We want an independent expert perspective on this from around analyst firm in the technology space. So that's why we commissioned Forrester to work with us on this study. So with that introduction and the context of why we commissioned the study, I would like to hand over to Chris, first of all, to provide an industry overview of the space, and then Mary will take you through the study and the benefits case. And just before I do that, just a reminder for people who arrived after I started, we'll be taking questions or capturing questions throughout. If you can type your questions in the Q&A box on the Zoom call and then vote them up and down, and we'll do questions after the presentation has finished. So I'm just going to fire up the presentation, and then Chris, it will be over to you.
Wonderful. Awesome. Thank you very much, John. So as John was saying, the idea of paved roads and you build it, you run it, all these concepts about DevOps, they're kind of like at the root of it is this whole notion of DevOps. Last year, myself and a colleague, fellow analyst, Charles Betts, kind of set out for a quest to understand, there's so much stuff talked about DevOps. It's DevOps is dead, DevOps is alive, DevOps is this, DevOps is that. And so we said, all right, we're going to just start with a basic question, like what does DevOps mean to you? And we interviewed about 50 different companies, and we wanted to know, is it a methodology? Is it a tool? How do you think about it? Where do you see things going? And we called, this research kind of like the future of DevOps. What's going to happen with it? because there's so much written about it. And this is what we found out. Found out these three main tenets that are really have nothing to do with the technology it takes to deliver DevOps, although that's an important underpinning. It's really that DevOps has actually proven to have real business impact. And we get this a lot, like, well, is going faster really better? If I release 100 times a day versus once a year, what's the difference as long as the user gets their stuff, right? And like the reality is that DevOps actually delivers real business impact as far as shorter time to market, the ability to actually have an idea, curate it, build it, release it, get it in front of a customer in a production ready environment. That is something that people have said that has actually resulted in more revenue. Shorter time to market is a real winner. When we can get new ideas out there, we can reach our market opportunity windows, we can get things in front of users, we can test them. That is very important. Especially during the pandemic, this next one came up, greater business agility. People that had modern platforms could add, like if you were a grocery store and you suddenly needed curbside pickup, if you had an old clunky system, like you had to bring in a whole consulting team maybe to do that for you, or you could maybe take your existing system, add some incremental capability, and then add that ability to do it. So greater business agility, the idea of going faster, having automation, maybe sounds rigid, but the reality is that it allows you to introduce new product lines or variations of product lines. It allows you to switch and take that platform and maybe point it at slightly different and adjacent markets much easier than if you have a clunky system that doesn't really work very well. And then the most interesting one, and maybe counterintuitive, is that automating everything and being better at delivering software actually results in greater business resilience. Why? Take a look at Log4j or other issues that have come up, right? If you are suddenly hit with some of these supply chain attacks that, no fault of your own, you were doing all the right things, but suddenly you realize you don't have DevOps. You have to go call in your entire engineering team, your operations team. You have to run a hot fix. You have to go through all these issues. Well, if you have greater business resilience, if you have DevOps, you're able to actually manage those kinds of conditions, manage those issues during daytime hours, get new products out the door, get fixes to those products out the door, react to issues happening in production in a much more real-time way and a much more impactful way. You get these three things, right? You get shorter time to market agility and you get business resilience. So those are three real benefits, real business benefits. And what's interesting about business benefits is that oftentimes, we're all engineers, we're all very technically oriented. We think about the automation, we think about the testing, we think about, the whole idea of build time and all these other kinds of things, but we don't always do a good job as engineers talking about that business impact. And it's really important to bring this business impact out. So let's talk about this next slide. One of the interesting things that we've been doing separately is this notion of agile businesses and being able to be adaptive to different situations. And so one of the things that we did is we actually came up with these two dimensions of technology operations performance, and we divided them into four segments. There's like a technology direction and a cultural, direction. And we try to understand, all right, well, how does that relate to, high performer, low performer, or dimensions rather, and what we discovered is that there's a correlation between high performing organizations that release more frequently. Now, you might say, well, release more frequently doesn't necessarily say anything, but what it does say is that you have an automated system that allows you to release more frequently. You have an automated system that can get ideas out the door. And if you're actually using DevOps and you're releasing more frequently, then that correlates back to the high performers that we've seen as far as financial performance goes. So that's a very interesting thing. Not only are people telling us, like on that first slide, that they believe that there's shorter time to market, they believe greater business agility, they believe in business resilience, but the financial performance is actually backed up by this ability. So it's really quite interesting to put those two things together in the business context. Next slide, John. However, even though we know that going faster is, is going to help us with business, even though we know DevOps is going to help us be all those three great factors, shorter time to market and whatnot, there are too many businesses that are really failing at DevOps. they are thinking about it maybe only in a single dimension, like let's get CI/CD and we'll call it a day. We'll have our tool chain and we'll be done with it. The reality is, over the last several years, what we are seeing is sort of what I would call a glacier shift of, like, this peak of, we want where the top performers are is slowly moving towards, like, we go from maybe a bi-yearly or quarterly release over to maybe a weekly able to release. And what we mean by release is the idea to get any artifact out the door. And it's just slowly inching along year by year. It's not like leaps and bounds. You think if people had like adopted DevOps 5 years ago, they'd be seeing these astronomical changes where they can actually automate and get things out the door quickly. But the reality is that the number of companies that are actually succeeding at it is actually incrementally improving every year, but at a very small incremental pace. And I think that requires us to maybe step back a minute and think about what the definition of DevOps really is. And so it's important to realize, and I'm not going to read this word for word, but that DevOps is people, practices, and platforms. It's all three of these things. And if you're not tackling all three of these things, if you're not thinking about the culture or the organization structure, if you're not thinking about those things, or how your methodology is, how you collaborate, how you work together, if you're not thinking about those things in the context of DevOps and automation, you're probably not making a lot of progress. You might be making progress in a very small scope or phase of your SDLC. Like, hey, the engineers are able to build code real quickly and integrate it and get it ready for deployment. But then it probably just sits there like, rotting boxes from Amazon on your front doorstep in a rainstorm, waiting for the next number of boxes. And imagine like you couldn't go out to your doorstep to get your packages until everything was delivered. Well, after a few rainstorms and snowstorms like we get in New Hampshire, everything would be ruined, right? And so this is what's happening to people's source code. They're building these microservices, but they can't release them because they're waiting on these other dependencies to get done. And they can't release it all at once because it's too expensive to release those things on an incremental basis, or they haven't got it quite managed to how to incrementally release things on an as needed basis. And they have these like release trains that take like a quarter to actually assemble. And then when you finally get there, you realize half the stuff that's on that release train is out of sync with the other half of the stuff that just arrived yesterday. And so it just doesn't work. Right? It just doesn't work at all if you don't take these three things into consideration, that you really need to understand how to better collaborate, how to work together, and come up with methodologies that allow teams to be a little bit more asynchronous, a little more, I build it, I own it, so I'm going to put it out the door and take care of it, and less about, we're going to throw it over the wall and hope that the next team takes over. So this is all part of this trend of the development team owning more responsibility, the development team taking on more responsibility, and the development team really stretching into the operation side. On the operation side, it means the operators need to understand what it means to be more of a developer, and the idea that, like, well, we can't have snowflake systems, we can't have snowflake deployments. We really need to automate all that. And so this whole developer kind of mentality of automate everything really needs to take hold and really needs to kind of form the basis for your DevOps and your DevOps culture. I'm noticing that that's all in green up there. Probably should have been in white. Maybe next time, John, we'll fix that. So anyways, like, this is really kind of the mantra, like, where there's this greater, not only responsibility, but accountability, right? Where people that understand how to develop code are working and more collaboratively working with the operations folks. The operations folks are more and more understanding the ideas and ideals of agile and development, and incorporating those into like what maybe called the SRE, site reliability engineer. They're not just renaming their IT team to SRE. They're actually thinking about, how do we actually, add leverage to our team and our ability through development and software engineering principles. So it's quite interesting. But while this is going on, there's other things happening. And that is, next slide, that modern DevOps is really complicated. It's not easy anymore. It's not like I came from Microsoft and I worked on Office 365, and you'd think that that'd be like the most complex thing in the world. When we developed it, it was just a big giant ASPX app that sat on top of a bunch of different APIs. It really wasn't much more than that. It was a giant monolith. Well, You take that monolith today, it's probably 1,000 different microservices. You need to coordinate all those. You have all these build pipelines going on. You have all kinds of test automation going on, release automation, and security on top of all that, right? It just becomes very complicated. It's a distributed model. And anytime you have a distributed model, there's no single point of control. There's no single point of like sort of observability. Everybody kind of has to take their piece and own it and make sure that they're doing the best that they can. And it can be kind of complicated. So like while we're talking about the fact that, DevOps is more than just CI and CD, it's sort of CI and CD distributed amongst, maybe tens or hundreds of teams. So that's not easy. And I kind of got ahead of myself on this next slide. But the idea of DevSecOps, right? That is taking hold. People realize now that, like as I mentioned, Log4j, the SolarWinds, other types of vulnerabilities. If you're not really embracing security and shift left operational ownership of security and joint ownership of security rules and principles into the development lifecycle, all you're really doing is adding technical debt to your workload, right? You're taking the code, you're ignoring or looking past some of those security issues. You're getting them all the way to your artifact repo and into your pre-prod system. And then your security team looks at it and says, none of this stuff works. It's all going to, this cross-site scripting, there's SQL injection, go back and do it again. Well, this is the other reason why we see a lot of slowdowns in the DevOps world, right? Because people don't have this collaboration piece down. The reality is that there should be a security component to almost every single aspect and every phase of software delivery. Should be something plugged into your IDE that's telling you when you have some of these SQL injection issues or you're using an out-of-date library. Should be something built into your build pipeline that tells you, hey, some of these things are going through your build pipeline that don't have the right, version or the approved version for this library, or you've got some sort of SQL injection issue, or you've got some sort of hidden credential inside your code. And then when you get to production, there should be some other piece that's like doing dynamic analysis or maybe some other additional static code analysis, every single phase. So adding greater complexity, right? So these things are hard to do. And if you look at like the next slide, what people are really trying to focus on, it's like, well, I need to hire more developers, but finding them is almost impossible. They're just really scarce. And I need to, so like we're seeing like a 405%, increase in the people that need software engineers. There's just not that many in the world. So training and getting help and trying to figure out how to, elevate your game is just not easy. And so, this whole research and this whole study really talked about the concepts of how do you do DevOps and do DevOps at scale. So one of the interesting things that we've discovered, and one way that you can do it, is really by thinking about DevOps platforms. And so let's talk about that for a second, John. Let's go to the next slide. So while teams are trying to have everybody do everything, that can be really complicated at scale. And what a lot of enterprises are discovering is that having a platform where the developers are sort of your customers of your platform is an interesting way to think about it. So typically when you think about customers, you're buying a product and you're the customer. But in this particular case, or if you're doing like shared services or a COE type thing, you're like, all right, well, we've got this like known group of experts. But a lot of times those models don't work. Shared services are sort of like, if somebody wants to use it, they can use it. And a COE sometimes turns into ivory tower-ish, kind of like these are the best practices, but nobody actually knows how to follow them. A platform team kind of creates, or a platform approach can create a home for people that are development-minded, but like automation, that think about how to automate the tool system, think about the fact that the customer is their developer, and they think about these sort of building these platforms as a product to serve every phase of DevOps, where they're judged by the outcomes that they help that DevOps team, those product teams deliver, and that they're seen by their leadership as critical to success. And so these platforms are sort of evolving out of enterprises that used to have IT teams that were overburdened by hundreds of different requests for all kinds of things, whether it was fix my laptop or, install Jenkins, to, hey, we're going to focus on this business critical activity of creating an automation platform to deliver software to our customers. And so that is kind of a professional approach to approaching DevOps, where they are the experts of the company who say, we understand what CI/CD, what planning tools there are, what feature management tools there are out there, A/B testing tools there are out there, containerization applications, container scanning, artifact repo, all those tools, they understand how to curate those, build the tool chain, and help you build this paved road that John was talking about to help your company actually deliver things more quickly. Now, the next slide is really kind of the interesting part that kind of ties it all back together. One of the most important things that you can do is to get going on this quickly, but get going on it means you have expertise in-house. You have people that you can spare to actually work on this. You know, the whole idea of how do we fix and repair and update our airplane while we're flying it? Well, it's not easy. Sometimes you need to get help. And one of the things that we've discovered is that working with a company that you can co-innovate with is actually quite valuable. Someone who doesn't just come in and says, oh, we'll deliver you a DevOps chain, here it is, plops it on your desk and walks away. Someone who sits down with you, understands your business problem, and is willing to co-innovate and create a custom solution for you that helps you deliver the business value that is designed for your business. Whether you're a coffee shop, a grocery store, or an automotive manufacturer, this kind of co-innovation listens to what you're doing, works with you to build a common solution, and then is there as your partner afterwards. And so that was kind of the fun and interesting thing about working with Equal experts, is that that's how their customers, you know, in all the interviews kind of came across as their relationship with Equal experts. And it was really quite fulfilling to work on this research. So I'm going to hand it off to Mary. She's our consulting expert on this whole research methodology, but it was really a pleasure speaking with you today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris.
And just, so Mary, just before you start, that's fantastic. Thank you, Chris. That's excellent. Really resonates with the sort of work that we do, the kind of engagements that we kind of take on, and the challenges that we see. So that's brilliant. Thank you. I just want to remind people to keep adding questions to the Q&As. You've got them. We've got two there, two great questions actually already. So thank you very much. But sorry, yes, Mary, handing over to you now. Thank you.
No, I'm really glad to be here today to talk about this. I was super excited to have Chris join me on these calls, so I'm going to ask him to comment on some of these aspects as well. But first, I have to start with a little bit of housekeeping. It's a disclosure that says that this work was commissioned by Equal experts and completed independently by Forrester, which maintains editorial control. The customer names were provided by Equal experts, but they did not participate in those interviews. And lastly, Forrester does not endorse any products or services. With that, let's talk about what I'm going to cover today. First of all, for those of you who may be unfamiliar, we're going to cover what is a TEI, a total economic impact study. We'll go through a little bit of a high-level results with an executive summary. Then we'll go a little bit more into detail about what these particular customers experienced, what they were facing before they engaged with Equal experts, and then what happened, what drove them to finding Equal experts to work with them. We'll talk about the study results, and we'll show you the financial summary. And then I'm looking forward to questions and answers with the team, both about what Chris has covered and what we'll cover here in this section. So I really wanted to start with something that was a typical quote from what we heard from the people that we interviewed. Each of them sort of had a unique need that would not be met without a custom development effort. In this case, the customer was referring to being able to develop a digital presence that was really reflective of the brick and mortar experience that they had created for their customers. And so she's saying that they really wanted something that would help them be able to differentiate from their competitors. And they said if they bought something that wasn't customized to them, they would only ever be able to offer what their competitors offered. So that was part of the driving force for them. And really each one of the customers that we spoke with had some unique need. But Forrester has been conducting TEI studies for over 20 years. The TEI methodology allows us to develop the business use case that Chris and John mentioned, so that we can do that in a consistent, repeatable way. We consider the benefits, we look at the costs, We look at the flexibility, again, what Chris mentioned with the agility aspect in his presentation, and then the risk that an organization sees with their technology investment. As a third-party objective analyst, we use standard financial methods and terms, and for those of you who may be unfamiliar with them, they're outlined in the appendix of the full study. By the way, this is an abridged version of the full study, which you can get from Equal Experts. I believe there might even be a link, I'm not sure, in the chat today.
We'll
So,
put that in, yeah.
okay, great. So the approach for a TEI on the next slide is it begins with due diligence. We started to work with Equal Experts as well as other sources to kind of understand that the impact that the customer might see with the investment. Next, we independently interviewed the customer representatives. I think we interviewed 7 people across 4 organizations for this study. And then we apply the data from those interviews to create a financial model. And from that, we build the story, the real customer view. We talk about TEIs as being the voice of the customer. So you'll hear what I say today. I don't offer any opinions. I'm just telling you what customers told us. And finally, we review that and finalize it before publishing. We allow each of the customers, as a matter of fact, to review it to make sure we haven't altered anything they've said or misconstrued anything they've said. Then for this study, we found that the 3-year impact for the composite organization that we built was that they saw an ROI of 123%, which balanced about $62 million in benefits against about 45, which ended with a $45 million net present value and a pretty quick payback. Forrester, the interviewees that we talked to are on the next slide. We've got some details about them. We interviewed one retail organization in the UK. They varied, were on the low side with only 40 microservices, and we went through some consulting and other retail, and then government services. There was a huge implementation with 900 microservices, and you can imagine how specialized that needed to be to address the needs of a government service agency. So what were the challenges? What made people come to Equal Experts in the first place? Well, first of all, they realized they had a suboptimal digital presence. Each of the interviewees had been found lacking in their digital presence and had received some sort of a mandate, either internally from their own strategic demands, or in the case of the government agency, they had an external mandate to deliver a new set of digital services and experiences. Again, similar to what Chris talked about, there were very slow processes to move ideas to deployment. And a lot of that came from uncertainty about how to do it, as well as the, stymies that they experienced that Chris described. They all identified their uncertainty and inexperience as a factor in that delayed response. And then an inability, the follow-on effect, the inability to innovate at scale. If they're still slow moving ideas, they're not keeping up with their strategies. Even in the pre-Equal Experts world, they certainly weren't able to move these to innovate at scale. And I think, Chris, you mentioned what happened in the pandemic. One of our interviewees here had very little digital presence, if any, and it was an existential crisis to be able to get to the point where they could offer digital services at scale.
Right, exactly.
And then finally, just really heavy maintenance requirements. They were burdened with heavy maintenance requirements of outdated and cumbersome infrastructure. It took money, it took time to develop attention span, all of the negative aspects that you would think about with that. So throughout this presentation, I will be sharing quotes from the interviews that just tell the story beyond the quantified benefits that we talk about. And this, again, speaks to that mandate that they had a set of exemplar services that they were mandated to build. They knew they'd need somewhere to host these new services. That meant they needed to, bring their infrastructure up to scale. They needed a resilient, scalable cloud platform. And then the final thing was something we heard across the board. This was not something we had or had any experience of. So they knew that they really needed to find somebody to work with to fix this. So they came up with a set of solution requirements, and each of these reflect what we heard in some form or another from each of the customers that we spoke of. First of all, they needed to build and run differentiated from their customers or differentiated from anything that was available in the market, but differentiated digital services. They also, in that previous quote, you heard him say, we didn't have any experience with doing this. So another big motivation for working with a group like Equal Experts with the experience that they bring to the table was they wanted to upskill their own employees to develop that ability to co-innovate, as Chris mentioned, when you bring in a third party. And then finally, that scalability. Again, we know we need to grow. We don't know how to do it, but we have to understand that we will be able to scale in order to make this a feasible solution to the problems that we're facing. So again, they were really looking for an organization that would be able to pair with their engineers and use their experience and bring them up to a better level of understanding modern development practices, a better level of understanding of what was possible, and how they would get there and what the best path to get there would be. So in creating this business case for Equal Experts, we took the experience we had. We realized we had interviewed 2 retail organizations and that was a very good framework for which we could think about this. Now, it's not separate from the consulting firm. Their developments were lots of times they were for internal use. It smoothed their operations, but again, affected their annual revenue directly. This, for purposes of this analysis, we assumed a $1 billion annual revenue and an annual growth target of 20%. So what did this composite organization, what were the results? So from our analysis, we determined that an organization of this type would see a 3-year present value of almost $62 million. And that was really spread across 4 particular benefits that can be logically grouped in 2 categories. The first one is the impact on profit, direct impact on the top line revenue that the company was able to generate. And then the others were grouped around cost reduction. And we can talk more about each one of these, drill down a little bit farther. But the biggest one was this increased profit from faster time to market. Now, I should say before I go any further that part of our interview was each of these organizations had laid out what they thought was a feasible path for them to address these issues. And they had all laid out something like a 3-year plan to start putting these services in place. And what they found when they started to work with Equal Experts was their original projections of being able to get the first service out to market in 18 months was reduced to 7 months, because Equal Experts came in with the experience and the know-how to keep them from making all of the side mistakes that they based on just inexperience. So the financial impact of that was about $41 million. So we're starting, instead of seeing revenues from these digital services beginning a year and a half later, we're starting to see them in 7 months. And then cumulatively, each month, they're issuing new services. And that builds over time to this benefit of over $41 million for the composite. The just still on that previous slide, one of the quotes we had was, before Equal Experts, our concept to cash timeline was looking around 18 to 24 months even. So we conservatively estimated this at 18 months. Whereas in 2018, that was achieved in about 6 months. And I think it would be faster now. So they're even accelerating beyond this. Beyond that time, so at some point, those services, now we can go on to the next. This is increased profits from the differentiated digital services. Even after that 11-month, 12-month gain was achieved, for the lifetime of these services, the interviewees that we talked to estimated that they saw about a 60% improvement over what they had thought they would do in profits with these digital services. So for the life of them, over that 3-year period, they achieved about another $20 million in impact to revenue. The next aspect of this was that, and this was important in 2 ways. We can measure the exact dollar amount of the time that was spent, but they estimated that they saved about 13,000 hours on configuration times. It said, one of the interviews said, we've been able to change the building of environments for a new product from a 6-month project to provisioning all of the infrastructure down to 1 day, and actually even in a couple of hours, we can spin it up now. So that's, again, what Chris was talking about with having the infrastructure in place. And Chris, I meant to ask you to jump in here and comment on these as well, because you were in those interviews with me, these customers.
Yeah, well, so basically most people don't have, they haven't done it before. And so they haven't created these kinds of automation systems, or even managed, the number of microservices you were talking about at scale. It's very complicated, right? So you can either try the iterative approach where you try and fail, and you try and get it right, or you send people off to conferences and you try to train them. But the guys at Equal Experts have already seen, dozens of clients that have already solved some of these very similar problems in the same business areas. So having somebody be able to come in and just sort of like say, these are the best practices and we can apply them to your unique business case has really, I would say, accelerated their ability to get to where they are right now. I mean, it's quite possible that everybody that is a client of any consulting firm would eventually, solve some technical issue on their own, but it might take them years versus months. And during the pandemic, people only had days. They were literally, thinking about like, how are we going to stay in business tomorrow? And so that's when you need, and things haven't really gotten much better, right? The pandemic's over, but now we have this other economic crisis going over that's left over. And, there's just a lot of, unrest. And there's, on top of all that, the pandemic left all these developers free to work wherever the heck they wanted to. So, job mobility, the great resignation, all of these things make it just hard to get people. So having a trusted resource that can come in, help you elevate your game. And then when you leave, you're actually, when they leave, you're actually in a better shape than you were before. The idea of like, don't just give me fish, teach me how to fish type thing. That analogy, it's just, it just works out well. So everyone had a really positive thing to say about having a partner to work with that could sort of hold their hand through all the process and get them where they needed to be.
Right. And as you said, they had days. I think we had one quote from the Government Services Agency saying that they had to have a pandemic response in weeks. And because they had already been working with Equal Experts, already had that infrastructure in place, they were able to spin it up in 4 weeks.
Yep.
So we'll talk more about some of these things in the unquantified benefits as well, which we also want to talk about. But the last thing here was really speaks to another aspect of what Chris was talking about, building security in from the start. We had several customers tell us that was a big part of it, but one of them was able to really drill down to an 85% reduction in incidences. They were talking about, particularly as a retail organization, building up for big events like Black Friday and being able to scale their ability to handle that kind of volume. And there was a real financial impact of, $544,000 in just uptime, not losing revenues based on downtime. But Chris, you can talk more about how that.
Right. So a lot of people only talk about security in terms of, oh, we prevented an attack, or we stopped something from happening. But the reality is that building security in is a way to actually, protect profit, protect money, prevent having to pay out fees or fines or whatever. And so, and then when you can do it right and at scale and at speed, it's all the better. So this customer was really just talking about, or this particular use case was really talking about that kind of ability to really preserve the money they were making versus, whether it was escaping through theft or escaping through fines or fees. It was really powerful.
Right. And then there are lots of benefits that the organizations recognize that they couldn't really quantify. Part of it is that improved customer experience. And yes, that's reflected some in the better improvement of the digital services, but there's also that intangible quality there. All of these are things that I know Chris can weigh in on as well.
Sure, I'll weigh in on all of them if you want.
Okay.
So improved customer experience, Forrester has research that shows customer experience is directly correlated to revenue. So even though we weren't able to do that in this particular research, we have independent research that shows an improved customer experience can indeed help you with revenue and other forms of customer retention. Improved developer experience is really about retaining the people that are in your company, giving them an experience to be able to accelerate and deliver ideas very quickly, and also giving them a great place to work, great tools to work with, and just get better stuff out the door. The employee skill development part is just really hard to do. It's really hard to sort of play whack-a-mole and figure out what should I be learning right now. So having somebody that can come in and help you with the immediate issues at hand allows you to focus, allows you to understand what the problem is and get things done. And then business agility, I already spoke about. Forrester has independent research that shows business agility equates to business survival and the ability to accelerate past the laggards who aren't thinking about those things. They're just thinking about, how do I preserve capital? How do I stop from going out of business? Versus, how do I actually improve customer experience? How do I improve internal experience? How do I just continue to move forward, even in the worst of economic times? And so that's what it's all about, having somebody that understands those things and can help you with them. And
in particular, in the case of the customers that we spoke with, first of all, the improved customer experience. The one retailer that we talked extensively about how much they had worked on developing an experience for their customers in their brick and mortar stores, and being able to develop something that was so customized to that same experience and deliver it was very important to them. Yep. The improved developer experience is also reflected in those reduced hours spent configuring. I mean, these are engineers who want to be developing stuff. They don't want to be building stacks of infrastructure to deal with it. So this was, again, you take away those routine tasks that they don't enjoy, give them an environment where they can really innovate at scale, innovate at speed, get excited. And they also mentioned, I think a couple of the customers mentioned that they were able to attract new developers because they saw that this organization was working in a modern development environment. It attracted better talent, younger talent, better talent to come in. Yep. Younger is better, I'll say clearly, but also
yeah, I wouldn't say that, but that's all right.
Well, I'm definitely not going to say that. Employee skill development, they talked directly to the fact that oftentimes they would see one of their engineers sitting beside an equal expert engineer who was mentoring them and bringing them along and working with them hand in hand. And then the business agility we've talked about numerous times, particularly being able to spin up that new government service to address the real needs of the British people in the face of the pandemic in just weeks. So to start getting some economic help just in weeks when such a crisis was faced, certainly all around the world. So we did have to balance, obviously, these benefits against some costs, which we can talk about. There were basically two sets of costs. There was the cost to build and run the digital platform, and build and maintain and run the digital services. So when we take those into account, that's how we get to our 123% ROI. This final quote, I just wanted to leave us with this thought, because it encompasses so many of the benefits that our analysis found. The employees have more skills. The managers have more confidence in their skills and the flexibility to create new strategies and services. But this quote also captures the value that they found in working with equal experts who brought their vast experience, but also worked in partnership with the organization. I love the word that you used, Chris, the co-innovation. They found that equal experts really began to understand the individual organizational vision and then key to execute on that. And then this person said, that's the key win for us. So it really brings together all the things we've been talking about. And that's why I wanted to finish with this one. And then finally, just again, the financial summary that just shows the net present value of $45 million to the organization and a pretty nice return on investment. So with that, I think we've got questions. I think I saw some questions come in.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. Thank you, Mary. I'm just going to stop sharing the presentation now. And you're right, there are a few questions, which is perfect. So the first one, I think, Steve, you put your hand up to have an initial go at this one. I'll read it aloud so that others know what you're answering. The question was, how would you react to recent questioning complexity DevOps has brought to, or recent complexity DevOps has brought to the enterprise? Someone was saying, there's a quote here saying the world is going to collapse on its own complexity, which is a quote by, I think, Kelsey Hightower. I won't go into the rest of these, but there's a mention of Kubernetes in there. Steve, you wanted to have a go at this first. Sorry.
Yes. Chris will give a more complicated, more detailed answer, but yes, it's something that equal experts we really worry about. A colleague of mine, Adam Hansrod, wrote some great thought leadership for us about a year ago now, talking about picking a compute that reduces your maintenance. In 2018, I don't think I'm portraying any confidence to say Adam and I were working at a customer together. He pulled me to one side and said, we shouldn't be doing Kubernetes here. And I took him outside and I gave him a stern talking to, and I was like, not now. We've just started doing it. Adam went on to build a platform with one of the customers in this TEI study. They did not choose Kubernetes, they went with Google Cloud Run. And the customer was absolutely delighted with the low amount of unplanned BAU work, the low number of platform engineers, both employees and equal experts consultants required to run that platform, to build those paved roads. And now with customers since that time, when I, as head of scale, when I'm talking to new customers, I advise them to not start with Kubernetes. I do have something in my backlog called Stop Starting Kubernetes, as in if you've already got it and you've got over the learning curve and you can figure out the BAU maintenance work, then that's great. But it's not something we'd advise today. There are other tools out there like Istio as well that create even more BAU work. And that's something that really troubles us. At Equal Experts, we try hard to build something with our customers as partners. And we do think about what will this look like after we leave? And if something needs babysitting after we leave, then we've done something wrong. And that's something with tools like Kubernetes and Istio that I'm really uncomfortable with. Now, Chris is going to give a much better answer than me.
So the idea of complexity and the expansion of complexity and what we call cognitive load on top of the development team is a real issue, right? Everyone's like, oh, we're going to have everyone be full stack because we read about it 5 years ago. And it's like, you can't expect an engineer to understand the programming language, the product problem being solved, all of the various pieces of infrastructure that code now needs to run on, and then the cloud platform that, oh, by the way, everybody wants to be multi-cloud now. So I need to be an expert in AWS, Google, and Microsoft. And I'm going to learn about this thing called Kubernetes at the same time. Oh, that's no big deal. One person can easily do that. You could expect them to write hello world maybe and get that out the door. I mean, that's about it, right? And so we're seeing a couple different trends that are really, I'd say, parallel to this. One is, I'm tired of a complex bespoke tool chain. I am literally thinking, like we have companies that said, we used to have this really complex thing with all these branches and all this stuff. Once we moved to the cloud, we realized, first of all, speed is more important than complexity. Speed is more important than having all these custom rules in our CI/CD tool chain. And it turns out that some of these all-in-one tool chains, like say, GitHub with GitHub Actions and Microsoft, or GitLab with all the tools connected, or Circle CI and simplify down what I can get out the door. It's actually easier than managing a 1,000 Jenkins servers on premise with 1,000 different rules and 1,000 different plugins. It's less complex. Yeah, I can't do the same kind of things I used to be able to do. I can't cut off the same kind of branches and that. But guess what? The 80-20 rule takes over. I can get 80% of what I need to do done at 80% faster than I used to be able to do. So complexity is definitely overwhelming. People are trying to simplify in multiple different ways. And I think, Steve brought up a great point. Kubernetes is complicated. There are other ways to get the same kind of scale, ephemeral instances, and the kind of thing that you want to do. If you want to go Kubernetes, great, go ahead. If you want to learn about it, go ahead, but you don't have to. And so think about how can I get this done the simplest, least maintenance way with the least amount of technical debt and move forward. And having somebody that you can bounce ideas off of, like Steve and his team, like, well, these are our use cases, where does it fit? It is really great because they've seen what works and what doesn't work.
Thank you. Let's move on to the next question because we could do an hour on this easily.
Yeah.
Yes.
Excellent.
Yeah, we could. Sorry about that.
No, that's great. Perfect. I'm gonna pull the next one out from Stuart, who said, if there is such an acknowledged talent shortage for devs and engineers, EE and other service providers aren't immune to this globally acute problem. Which is true, certainly. So
Yeah.
enterprises just kicking the can down the road by filling this gap with third-party delivery services to solve backlog challenges. Is the current model unsustainable and therefore ripe for disruption? I just sort of tagged that, kind of like to have a quick first go at that. I think certainly there is a risk in organizations that do entirely just rely on third-party providers. Do sort of build more risk into their organization, which is why the way that we work, it was mentioned in some of the quotes, I think, and then sort of through the presentation, is very much a partnership, but also enablement and upskilling, and some of the unquantified, unfortunately unquantified, because it is hard to quantify, but there's such huge value there. Benefit of working with an organization like EE is we really want to focus on enabling and upskilling the people at the organization that we're working alongside. And we just think that's the right way to do business, because we want to be able to leave. We want people to be able to get rid of us when they've had enough. The value of working with consultancies is partially the external expertise they bring, but also that flexibility in terms of the cost. So, it's easier to ramp down a consultancy, or it should be, than it is to ramp down your employees. So that's definitely a part of the ethos of the way we provide services.
Yeah, I was going to say, as soon as I heard that question, that really ran counter to what we heard from your customers, and that they felt like they had not only built a digital platform, but they had built an engineering team to support that.
There is, though, a disruptive thing going on, if you don't mind me interjecting. We're also doing research on what we call low-code plus DevOps, which kind of sounds like an oxymoron in some ways, but it's not. We're hearing from companies that are backfilling, open development recs with professional low-code engineers who can turn ideas into actual products. They're using them at ISVs and other companies creating software. It doesn't mean that it... And this low code plus DevOps means that they still need to have expertise in how do I do infrastructure as code so I can deploy the engine and my code? How do I do low code at scale? How do I maintain governance and scale and complexity? How do I combine that with the other stuff that's being done by the traditional coders? So it doesn't necessarily mean that the complexity is going away, but what it does mean is that people are getting creative about what it means to be a developer these days. And it doesn't mean that, all the problems are going to go away in the future, but the disruptive thing that's going on is happening. It's like the whole necessity is the mother of invention. People are getting creative how they find their engineers, but you're still going to need expertise and pulling it all together.
Yeah, I think there is a disruption coming. I think I don't worry about it so much for expertise-driven consultancies like Equal Experts. I would worry more if I'm like a volume-driven consultancy. We often work in partnership with large consultancies that can provide an enormous amount of talented developers. And the way that it normally works out is that we work with your employees on the more complex outcomes, the paved roads internally, maybe your cloud search, your stock system if you're a retailer. And then for less difficult, less challenging business problems, of which you may have many that need to be solved in a short time to market, that's totally understandable. That may be where you deploy a volume supplier to work much more on, do you know what, we just have a bunch of problems here that we need to churn through with a bunch of people. In that space, I think low code is going to prove, low code, not no code, low code is going to prove to be really quite viable there. So if I was, I'd be a little bit more worried if Equal Experts was like, we provide people when we don't. We're an outcomes driven consultancy. And we really are based in on expertise.
Great. Super. So I think we've got 2 minutes left. I wonder if we could very quickly just do a quick round the room on the one question here. That's the next one that's been upvoted from Brian, that says, actually for Chris and Mary, so based on your industry experience, how common are the types of successes you highlighted in the wider industry, and how many organizations do you see adopting these principles and practices? So I think, yeah, how many organizations generally do you see being able to do DevOps right or adopt these principles and practices?
That's for you, Chris.
Yeah, it's a growing number. We are talking to banks, people like at oil and gas companies, government institutions. They're all going. They all recognize their own flaws and their own internal, struggles. I think the biggest problem that most of them are facing isn't that they're not good at CI and CD or other kinds of DevOps technologies, is that they're really bad at like breaking down the silos that get in between getting the work done. And so the funny thing is, like, most of the talking and writing I do about DevOps is really about how do you get data that shows you end-to-end performance? How do you get information about what's going on across the team so that you can take the data, look at it in the mirror and say, how can we actually get better? Because we understand the technology, we're trying to solve our customers' problems, but yet it takes too long to get an idea to be approved and budgeted. It takes too long to get the code, once it's done, into production. What's taking us so long? Or we don't collaborate with the other folks or the security team, or we don't collaborate with the operations team well. And so I think that that's going to be just a long journey for a lot of really big, complicated enterprises that many of them are plagued by. We're in a regulated industry, or we've just gone through a big M&A, which happens all the time. And I think you're going to see more of it in an economic downturn where different companies are eating other companies, but yet they got to keep those customers. And so there's never going to end, like where every time you think like, oh, everyone's catching up with DevOps, well, it's like seeds growing. There's more crops coming because now they got to merge two different things together. Now they got to merge these different leadership teams together. It's just a never-ending cycle. The key to understanding improving with DevOps is that the people like Microsoft, where I came from, and Amazon and Facebook, they don't look at it as ever being done. They never look at their engineering team as ever being done. They never look at it as everything being perfect. All they ever do is say, let's shake this up because we know we can do better. They're not afraid of reorging. They're not afraid of reskilling. They're not afraid of bringing somebody in to tell them how to do something different. They just know it's going to have to change.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's the only constant, change itself.
Exactly.
Excellent. Right. Well, we are at time and a little over, but so we'll stop it there. So I'd just like to say thank you very much to Mary and Chris joining us from Forrester, and thanks for your support on the study. It's really fascinating results. If anybody is interested in understanding more, or how you might be able to build the business case for your organization, please do reach out to me. I'm happy to help take people through the more detailed breakdown in the study, and also help apply that thinking to your organization as well, to sort of see if there's a way to help build that business case. And also thank you to Steve for joining us today. Obviously Steve's worked a lot on the study, and a lot of the customers that were involved in the study as our head of scale. Right, thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, my pleasure.